Um, so just a little bit about myself, husband, father, entrepreneur. I am retired from the home inspection industry, which I had a company and sold that in 2000. But I have several years in the home construction and remodeling, full time way back in the day, and part time throughout, most of the 22 plus years in the customer service management and engineering of project implementation industry, and 15 years in the real estate inspections and continuing education training. So I've done a lot of training for a lot of different agents, and it's an awesome marketing tool as well. So keep that in mind. Um, I have several slides here. So working expression, we're going to define the types of common causes of indoor air quality mold related issues. We're going to really focus on mold quite a bit, identify risk and potential health effects, explain the inspection and testing methods, describe the impact of indoor air quality mold issues on the real estate transaction, and provide answers to clients' commonly asked questions. So we're going to cover a lot. So I have several quotes for these slides as well, but this is the first one that I have is a man without education is like a building without a foundation. So we don't know that too well. Um, but anyhow, in the U.S., the U.S. Protection Agency, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the indoor air quality refers to the air quality within and around buildings and structures as it relates to the health and comfort of the building occupants. So there's a lot of emphasis on how it affects people, and so on. Um, and we're going to cover a couple more things from the EPA as well, later in the slides. But just a little history about mold. It's been around forever. There's the Irigo epidemic in the 1900s. It affected rye and other grains. It caused convulsions and gangrene. It affected a lot of people. And then there's the Irish potato famine of the 1800s. It accounted for over 1 million deaths, which at that time was 26% decrease in the population. And then also it's mentioned in the Bible, Leviticus 14, the signs of home contamination. Um, it's just this is actually a brief, snapshot of Leviticus. It talks about the priest goes inside, inspects the home. It says any red depressions appear. They close the house up for 7 days, and then on the seventh day, the or the priest returns, and if the red depressions and so on is still present or spreads, the contaminated stones and plaster are to be pulled out of the house and thrown into an unclean place outside of the city. Um, then the second part is if they do a reinspection, and if the mildew has reappeared or spread, and it's still in the same areas, the entire house has to be torn down with its stones, timbers, and all the plaster, and then it's not taken outside the house. And then any people inside the house, they have to go through a cleaning process or clean as they did back in the day. And do a lot of stuff on that side. So we really know who the very first inspector really is the police. So the first homicides. But the questions, if you have any questions throughout the slides, I have a lot of these slides in there. Some of them are placeholders just for myself. It just shows where there's a change of a topic or discussion. But any questions you may have throughout, feel free to enter them either in the chat box or the Q&A. So there'll be multiple opportunities for that as well. So why the increased concern? There's a more conscious home buyers, advanced medical industry, family health concerns, a lot of self-awareness and how people are affected. Excuse me. And then there's always this greater risk or exposure A lot of it is because the so much more time is spent indoors today than it previously was. 90% of the time is indoors, and the indoor air quality is 10 times more polluted than the air outside of the house. So therefore, there's a lot more, advantage from that standpoint. Um, so what changed is there's more insulation in houses today. They're a lot tighter. They have house wrapping, so there's a lot more airtight construction going on from an energy standpoint. So there's less natural air circulation than there was in the older houses, which is just they were drafty. They weren't drafty on purpose. They were just drafty. Therefore, we'll call that natural air circulation. And then some other causes are the building materials themselves changed significantly, especially in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of new products coming out. So they, like instead of using plaster, they used drywall, and paneling was used quite a bit back in the 80s, early 90s also. From pine wood, they went to plywood, and today they're using OSB. So the newer materials don't handle moisture as well as some of the older materials, making things a little bit worse also. And then with the house being a lot, everything's really trapped inside from that standpoint. So indoor air quality, there's really three common categories that talk about indoor air quality: allergens, air pollutants, and mold. Although mold is an air pollutant, it's a huge impact, and so I really like to have it done. But we're going to first focus mostly on the ones that may affect the home, obviously. So allergens are going to be like your dander, rodent feces and dander, insects, roaches, bed bugs, etc. Pollen is a huge allergen that affecting lots of people outside and indoors. Some air pollutants, some typical air pollutants include smoke, carbon monoxide, VOCs, lead, heavy metals, asbestos, and even radon gases. So I'm not sure how many of you test for radon, but hopefully we're going to cover how to test for mold, and that's something to consider as I head on service. And then the four-letter word, of course, mold. That's a big one that we're really going to focus on. As far as the EPA, there are no standards. I'm sorry, there's regulations or standards for everyone. There's really nothing established. Like with the radon, we have four peak mercuries. Well, with mold, there is no level that says, "Oh, this is a good level. Anything higher is a bad level." Um, so there's also no regulations or standards for evaluating health effects because it affects everyone differently. It's some people may be susceptible to low counts of mold. Some people may not be affected until it's a much higher count of mold spores. So that's why there's really no set established limit to say below this level is good, below above this level, bad, like there is with radon. Um, so it's present on clothing, it's on carpet, it's in the air we breathe, it's pretty much everywhere. And it produces spores that are extremely small in size. So they can't be visible, they're not easily visible, and they can actually go airborne. So this is just taking this larger sphere here, the blue, if that's the size of a raindrop, then this red or orange one, this one here, would be comparable to the size of a mold or fungus spore, which is 120 to 1,000 times smaller in size than a raindrop, a droplet of water. So it just kind of goes to show how small an actual mold spore can really be. So it's pretty small in size. My references I used to use when I did these in person was the raindrop was a basketball, and I used to carry really small marbles and that's about the size of a marble. Like I said, it could be 1,000 times smaller in size than molecular water. So mold's considered a subgroup of the fungi kingdom, asexual, which means it can just reproduce on its own. Some types that include Cladosporium, Stachybotrys, Aspergillus penicillium, Vitis, Fusarium. There's some real common molds. Um, the Aspergillus penicillium is one of the most common. It's actually two separate molds. It's just that they're very hard to identify the difference between the two. So they combine them together in the lab. And the Stachybotrys one is the one of the most common. People talk about black mold. It's typically that one, and we're going to cover some testing of mold and some, what mold reports look like and all that as well. But that's why the asteroids and penicillin were grouped together. They just can't tell them apart from, where they're. Um, so the life cycle of a mold spore, we have the spore germination, then it goes to a hyphae growth, and then they got the spore formation, and then the spores themselves. And what they do is as they grow, they just kind of expand, they poof out, and all the spores go flying and floating around. They land on the surface and they start regrowing again. So that's where the sexual um so it's also a natural part of the environment, which is why, in a house, mold can be a very detrimental thing. And it's, easily, in a building, especially if the building's closed up and doesn't have a ventilation, which we'll talk about also. So it's also an important part of nature, breaks down dead organic matter, falling leaves and trees and so on. That's what really breaks down the process, and wood rot and so on. That's actually a mold product. That's what happens, what mold does. Reproduces, by means of tiny spores. Like I said, they just kind of expand and poof out on their own. Spores are like seeds, invisible to the naked eye. They float through the air, they deposit on the surface, and they start that whole cycle all over again. Um, so what does it do? It decays dead plant material, like I mentioned. It produces mycotoxins, and there's a lot of commercial uses for it as well. There are medicinal purposes such as penicillin, lovastatin, and this other one I can't quite mention, cyclosporin, are medications that are actually derived derivatives from different types of mold. But it's also used in food products such as meat, which is in almost any baking product, mushrooms, beer, cheese. It's all a mold process. So it's used, it does have some good points to it as well, especially if you like beer and like cold beer. So it must have the proper temperature. It slides between the temperatures between 60 and 90, and unfortunately or fortunately, that's also the temperature humans like to live in too, because it can be comfortable, a little toasty, but mold thrives in those temperatures. Most molds will grow in other extreme temperatures, but it really thrives in that temperature. It needs a food source, which is almost any organic matter is a food source. And then moisture, water, direct moisture doesn't have to be a actual leak. It could just be high relative humidity within a confined space is enough moisture which these other sources are available for mold to grow. So you really can't contain the temperature in the food source, but you can control and contain the moisture levels. And that's the key part of how you keep mold, at bay. So it's a critical key for the mold. But anyway, like I said, cellulose-based materials, building materials, wood, cardboard, paper facing on drywall. Like I said, they went from a lap and plaster, using drywall, which has a paper face on it. It became hotbed for mold growth. You don't need much moisture at that point. Any kind of organic matter, soaps, fabrics, dust containing skin cells. So mold doesn't need a whole lot to grow. And like I mentioned, I want to emphasize on the controlling the moisture part, how you really control the mold part of it. So most homes are damaged, or most homes that are damaged are due to water and moisture related issues, whether it's a roof leak, plumbing leaks, such as sewer or septic, other types of plumbing leaks that may occur, and ventilation. Like I said, relative humidity is the most common, and ventilation is a key part of that, either lack of or poor ventilation. So it's something that's kind of like that part of it can be controlled fairly easily compared to the other issues. So water and moisture is a problem. Mold is the symptom of water and moisture and all the other food sources and the temperature and so on. So you can't totally stop mold. Rare occurrence of mold spores may not be significant. Maybe a very low mold, like I had mentioned. Every person has a different level of what their body can withstand from mold. So some people have a very low tolerance that they may be affected by a very low level of mold, and people can withstand some levels of mold that's a little bit higher. So like I said, any questions or anything, put them in the Q&A, or you can put them here on in the chat room as well, and we'll cover them between AJ and I will cover. So why is mold so common inside houses? It's an ideal climate, plenty to eat in buildings, like I've been mentioning. It's a natural part of the building's materials. There's no competition or predators. There's nothing out there that eats mold, as far as making it go away, other than cleaning it or managing the relative humidity levels. Some types are very common, like I had mentioned, Cladiosporium, Stachybotrys, and Aspergillus penicillium. They're the most common three. There are a lot of others, but they're the most common three that are identified in houses. But here's a couple of pictures. The this picture is, a floor joist cavity. This particular house, they had a garden built on the outside, and the garden, the dirt, soil, and so on, was above the level of the rim joist, and so they got some moisture leaking in that area, and that occurred. Now, the one on the right is not a picture I was in that particular house, but it's closed houses. I know there was a time there were a lot of vacant houses and people turned systems off, and that is absolutely detrimental to controlling mold when the systems are all shut down, because then it's just a hotbed. The hot, humid, damp air inside. There's no air circulation, and this is not that unusual, unfortunately. The presence, of active or growth, it can be something from the past. It can be mold, it can impact your health significantly. Doesn't have to be something that's, there. It could be something that previously happened. And even when it's cleaned or visibly cleaned, there could just be some spores that are around somewhere that could potentially just regrow and start growing again and spreading and creating a lot more of a problem. So it's very such. Um, so three methods of potential contamination are going to be breathing in spores from the air, which is inhalation. It can be inhaled into your lungs and so on, which is the most common method. Skin, you can be you can touch it. It can be on your contact on your skin through or absorption through your skin. And this last one's, I think, pretty gross, but I'm sure it happens, is eating without washing your hands after handling something that's moldy. So ingestion can be another means of potential contamination. So they all happen, but inhaling it is the most common. These other ones do happen occasionally as well. Again, the different health effects. There's an allergic health effect, pathogenic, and toxic. And everyone's affected differently. So But your allergic reaction is most common. This could be just be a bad sinuses or cold-like symptoms, from sneezing, watery eyes, and so on. Um, then you have your people who are susceptible to asthma or have issues. They can trigger the asthma or worsen it. Hypersensitivity pneumonia develop, after acute or chronic exposure. Depends on how sensitive each person is from that standpoint. Other types of infections, in immune compromised people. Then the micro toxic is the most, dangerous. Poisoning. From evidence from humans. It's something that, again, somebody who has a very low tolerance level, certain molds may affect them a little differently. And then organic dust toxic syndrome, flu-like symptoms, and so on, most common reactions. Um, it can affect the respiratory and immune system, neurological disorders, nosebleeds, breathing lungs, coughing, sneezing, watery eyes, allergic reactions, rashes, and maybe worst case scenario, even death. But most times going to be your flu-like symptoms are going to be with how it's going to be affecting people. So things to check out, some red flags. Have you had recent water infiltration in a house? Yeah, excuse me. Um, do you have any velvety, slimy, white, black, green paint stuff, any kind of growth? Um, talk about, like, the most common you hear quite often, people talk about, oh, the black mold. The color of mold is really affected by the oxygen level, the food products. So there's a lot of variables that go into what color it's going to be. It could be almost any color. It could look like a rainbow. It just depends on what the product is, how much of the oxygen level, and so on. There's a lot of different variables. Up to 50% of all homes have some type of water compromise, whether it's a leak, a plumbing leak, a roof leak, or some other kind of leak. Um, but some other signs are discoloration or staining on the walls. Very common. And I have some pictures that will come up and show you some of those as well. Um, and then high excessive relative humidity levels. We'll talk about that here and more. But high would be greater than 60% in the summer months, greater than 30% in the winter months. Anything above those is a conducive condition for mold growth. What I used to do is I always had a relative humidity meter with me when I inspected, and would take readings throughout the house. And if any of them read to be high, that's a conducive condition to justify or warrant the possibility of having a mold sampling and testing done. And we're going to talk about that as well. But any kind of construction defects in HVAC and plumbing problems, improper venting and grading can have a big issue. The grading is going to affect it where you could have, high levels of moisture, seeping into the basement or crawl space areas. So there's a lot of things that can affect that make, produce a condition for mold growth. Again, human sensitivity, itchy eyes, burning sensation, on the skin, musty odor, change in breathing patterns reported by occupant, or yourself even during the inspection, could potentially be a justification for testing for mold. So some answers, to questions. Do I have mold growing in my home? Well, it's going to be more of a you don't know. Unless you physically see something, it could be hidden in the wall somewhere. And it's just finding or proving that there's a conducive condition in mold growth that justifies, having the testing done. Again, and identifying building defects, rot, warping, high relative humidity levels is the easiest one to do. So if you can just take readings with the humidity meter, or people being exposed to higher amounts of mold and what is in the background. We're going to talk about that quite a bit because there's usually three tests done. One of them is considered a background test, so you can compare the results from the interior levels to the what's in the background test, and that's how they determine if there's high levels of mold inside a house or not. That clothing, carpet, the air we breathe, some other area can be, like I said, mold can be everywhere. One of the big key areas that I've always looked for in the HVAC system is a big key area to look. This here is actually a house that I inspected. And there's some equipment problems. You look inside the blower fans inside the HVAC equipment, and you could see inside of it how dirty and moldy it is. And every time that fan turns on for your air conditioner or heating, it spreads those spores throughout the house and in the ductwork. This is a flexible ductwork. It can be an equipment problem, a lack of maintenance, which would typically be just a standard cleaning, or a poor system configuration. And that's what we found here at this house. This ductwork, this flexible ductwork, it was insulated, but it ran from one end of the attic space to the other, and they had, a couple of additions added. And it was probably a good 80 feet away. And just the fact that it was in the different attic spaces, it created moisture inside, and it didn't, the lower fan wasn't strong enough for the forced air to go through to keep it dry. So they actually, this is all mold growth. Oops, this is all mold growth down in here. You kind of see it sitting inside the ductwork here, and then you have the blower fan itself. So it was really a condition of there was a equipment issue, a poor design that they were doing. They were trying to send heat and air conditioning to a bedroom space that was pretty far away. Um, Another more common areas: kitchens, laundry rooms, bathrooms are a key part of where to look. Lack of ventilation is the typical. Equipment failures, like I talked, front and the back side of drywall. You can see some spots up in here, and it's telling me this is pretty common here. So what you don't see is is behind this wall. That could be 10 to 100 times worse or larger in size. So some people may look at this or this from here and say, "Oh, I have a little bit on the drywall, and I'll clean that surface." Well, you can't see the other side of the drywall unless you take that piece of drywall off and look behind it. And most of the time, it's going to be significantly worse in areas that you can't see. So it's, just because you see that, just the cleaning isn't it. It justifies the proper test to do it. You can do different types of testing. Air sampling is the easiest, bulk sample, and we're going to get into that a little bit as well. Um, so this is a house that I actually inspected. I remember this house. This is an old farmhouse I did. And you can kind of see that that's the meter I carried around with me just to measure the relative humidity everywhere I went. But they didn't have any ventilation in this basement, and you could see the underside of the insulation, how you can see pockets of moisture and mold growing all through it. And although a test wasn't needed to identify it, a test has to be done to prove or disprove, so you can say it's mold. Other than that, it's not something as a home inspector well, I wasn't in my state. I wasn't able to call it mold unless I had it tested at a lab and it was identified as mold, which I think that's correct in almost all the states as well. But this was actually house I inspected for that one. So again, where's mold found? And everywhere. Mold can be everywhere and anywhere. Leaks, it can be building materials changed, like I had mentioned. This is a little recap where mold is found. Equipment deficiencies, like I showed you with the HVAC systems, energy efficient construction. could be some of the problems, although it's from an energy standpoint, it's a great feature, but from a ventilation standpoint, it should affect things negatively unless you have proper ventilation. Um, and then you have a lot less natural air circulation as well. So, this is another one that I inspected here. And you can see that there's a little bit of mold showing on the wall here. Now, I didn't show the back. I don't have I had a picture of what the back looks like. Um, but this was this was a leak issue that occurred. Um, and had the entire carpeting, you see where it's all torn out, was soaking wet. So they had torn that out, but it was creating mold growth in the walls. So the way this has to get remediated is they just start drywall out until you have a clean piece of drywall, and then they kind of go from there to refurbish it. Um, all right, so if a house has no visible leaks, damage, or issues related to the construction systems, what key factors could define the house as conducive conditions for mold growth? So, we covered this a couple times, but relative humidity levels is the answer to that question. If somebody didn't get it, but so high excessive relative humidity levels caused by lack of or poor ventilation. Um, we just did for a webinar on insulation and ventilation. So I'm going to touch on ventilation a little bit here, but really, I'd say check out that other webinar, and we'll really get into the ventilation a little bit more in depth. But anyhow, high relative humidity level is a conducive condition for mold growth, like I had mentioned. But some of that is also caused by cooking, washing, poorly vented gas heaters. People breathing provide the primary source of moisture that causes humidity indoors. Person exhales approximately 200 milliliters of water vapor per hour while awake and 20 milliliters of water vapor per hour while asleep. So all that water vapor is going into the house, and if the house doesn't have the proper ventilation, it could cause enough relative humidity to create potential mold for us. So, this is another house picture. I inspected this basement, and you can see the shadowing on the ceiling here. That's actually droplets of water, and this is a cobweb that was across the about 6 inches to a foot below the ceiling, and they're all droplets of water sitting on the cobweb. That's how humid it was in this basement. It was pretty bad. And I don't remember the results of the mold testing, but that's a pretty serious condition there. Again, ventilation is key, especially in kitchens, baths, and laundry rooms. Basements are a critical part, crawl spaces, attics. Um, like I had mentioned, this other webinar, insulation and ventilation, is the ventilation is critical, especially in basements and crawl spaces and so on. And if you have your attic and basement ventilated properly, the rest of the house takes care of itself, typically. So it's just kind of something that, like, hey, if you follow the rules of thumb for the basement and attic, usually the rest of the house is okay. Um, but proper installation and ventilation, it reduces potential air pollutants, particularly mold. It improves energy efficiency, saving money, improves overall indoor air quality. A balanced system is critical. A balanced system is equal of exhaust and intake. That's a critical part of it, because if you have too much exhaust and not enough intake, air isn't going to move properly. So it's not a critical piece of the balanced system. That's for optimal air circulation. So again, any questions in the chat? We'll continue with a few. Mold needs three ingredients for growth: food source, temperature, and moisture. And moisture is the only one you can really control. Mold is found everywhere, and typical common causes: moisture intrusion, high relative humidity is a big one. Um, so a few things on the testing. It's not typical to be part of a home inspection process. It's performed as a secondary or optional service. We did those. My company did those as a add-on service, and it was a huge, huge money maker. I recommend everybody or anyone getting it. And because almost every house now, I'm from Pennsylvania, so in our area we have a lot of basements, and almost every between the basements and attics, almost every house you could find something that was considered conducive conditions for mold growth, therefore justifying mold testing. So we performed a lot of mold tests over our time, and it was a significant increase in the value of an addiction by being able to do those. So when conducive conditions are identified during the home inspection, further testing sampling is recommended. It's best to use a certified mold inspector and assessor, MIA. That is a classification that is not that difficult to acquire. And the assessor part is a key part of it, because then you can provide recommendations for repairs and so on. So there's a lot more going on to that. So different sample types. We're going to get into a couple of those. We have our air traps, which are the most common. There's several brands. I'm not stuck on one particular brand or anything like that. Another one would be direct sample. It could be a lift tape or a swab. Swabs are very common. Lift tapes are a little challenging. They didn't work as well. Swabs work much better. Or it could be a bulk sample where you actually take a piece of the material, and that could be challenging too, because especially on drywall, you have to cut out a little square, and I'll show you those on the next couple of slides also. But that's the air samplings. That's what they look like right here. They're the air canisters, and you use a bio type meter or the pump that actually has a measured amount of air intake, and it goes across. So these are the ones we use for aerosol. Lip tape and swabs. Swabs were real easy to use. Lift tapes didn't work as well, but the swab was easy on a smoother surface. We use swabs in HVAC systems because you can swab in the piece and do a test from that standpoint. That worked out really good. And then a bulk sample is a piece of the material, like something like this ceiling here in this picture. Um, I would cut maybe a 1 inch square piece of that paper that's on the drywall, and you can peel it off and put it in a baggie and send that to the lab, and they can test it from that standpoint. But here's someone that cut out. It looks like they cut out the whole square of drywall, but that's pretty nasty on the backside of that drywall. Again, here's another piece of drywall. So the bulk samples are pretty common. Also, it's not real difficult to get, but sometimes it can be challenging because you don't want to mess up the finished surface of where somebody can see. So typically you do three samples. Um, Again, one sample is typically on the outside. You see here, this is our setup, and this is this bio pump that we use with the aerosol canister. This is just one way to do it. There's a lot of other equipment out there. You're supposed to take an outside sample, and that is the baseline sample that when you take indoor samples, everything is compared to this outside sample. So this is the house that I showed you the HVAC system with the mold growth in the ductwork. And that ducting went to this room. And so that's why we tested every day outside. We tested that room. We tested another area too. But each of those canisters, each of these systems, they cover about 1,000 square feet area. As long as it's not closed off space like a bedroom or a basement or office. So if it's a closed off space, you have to do one outside, one inside. We typically did two in the basement and one outside, and then sometimes in attic spaces. Also, you have to be careful. You can't use these types of samples in really dusty locations. You like attic spaces, because it sucks in more dust than it does the actual mold spores if it's present. So it was a little bit challenging in attic spaces sometimes. From the fourth, I'll actually show you, see if I get this to work right. All right, so I'll try and pull that up. Let's see, here's one here. So here's a sample of a report. I don't know if everybody can see that, but you have your basics. And so here's the samples where it shows you your control sample. And then this is one of the samples. This is probably that house. It shows you, normal levels. And then this one shows problem or high levels right here. Penicillium aspergillus is the problem level here. Um, And then down lower, it kind of goes into detail about the effects of each of these types of molds that were identified. So it kind of really it goes into detail. It's a pretty comprehensive report. I found that it really goes a long way. I would just include this report in with my report and the findings, and it worked out real well from that perspective. So it's just a sample of a report that from a place we use from the lab. I just got to catch up and close all these windows I have open. Okay. Um, for some frequently asked questions, how can I tell if there's mold in my house? We kind of covered that. It's really is identify conducive conditions or find mold stains of mold and then have it tested. How did mold get in my house? That's usually identified and found as you're doing your home inspection. You might find something, but really focus on ventilation is a key issue or key concern. Especially, we found more addicts that the problem was just because it wasn't ventilated properly. How can I stop molds from growing in my house? Most of the time, it's proper ventilation, balanced system, and the amount of ventilation. But how's mold tested for and measured? We covered that. What kind of mold do I have? That's identified from the lab. Can I clean up the mold? Now the remediation part's a little challenging. I've never actually done the remediation, but I've worked with remediation companies to see how they were doing it, just so I could be a little more informative to the client about what to expect. How can we prevent it from returning? It depends on what the cause is and what are the risks. The risks are always going to be some type of a health risk and so on. So water is the problem, mold is the symptom. I know I mentioned that a couple times. Consider hidden wound for water damage. For visible water damage, that's when red flags are present. Be aware of different things. Identification and testing, you know, identification, conditions, cause, extent of the damage, test is needed, clean and protect. Remediate. You always recommend remediation companies to come and clean it properly, and perform post remediation tests. And this is a standard that the remediation company is not who should be doing the remediation testing. We did those also, and really it's the same test. But you test after the remediation company claims that it's clean, and then you and you should do this type of test prior to anything being closed in or finished. Because at that point, because what happened, and we've had one incident that I remember, is the people removed everything, cleaned it, supposedly, but put everything back. And then we did a post remediation test and it was still present. So they had to take everything out that they just redid and start from scratch. So it's just something you got to do this test before everything's closed, the remediation test. And it's really just a clearance test to make sure everything's clean. So what does mold need to grow? Food source, temperature, and moisture. Again, controlling moisture and ventilation. Control, it's how you control mold growth, control the moisture. So again, any questions or anything? We still have a handful of slides to get through. Do I get 10 minutes? Wow. All right. So we're going to talk about ventilation real quickly here. I only have a few slides. Like I said, it was a lot more information was on the webinar I did a couple weeks ago on insulation and ventilation. But ventilation is the intentional introduction of outdoor air into a space and is mainly used to control indoor air quality by diluting or displacing air pollutants. It can also be used for the purpose of thermal comfort and dehumidification. Dehumidification is the key of proper ventilation. Maintain essential ventilation of roof space from outside, essential moisture extraction from bathrooms and kitchens, especially bathrooms. So in bathrooms, for instance, every house should have an exhaust fan. It's not a requirement. Um, it is for newer construction now. But those exhaust fans should run at least 30 minutes after people take a shower. That's the only way to remove all that steam and moisture is 30 minutes is that magical number. Um, Maintain essential ventilation in rooms with fuel burning appliances, making sure you have enough combustion air and so on, so it burns properly and cleaner. The critical factors of proper ventilation, I talked about a balanced system briefly, but how much is enough in a balanced system are the two critical factors of ventilation. It's good to know them. You don't have to actually do calculations as a home inspection, but it's good to know how much is enough. So the rule of thumb is 1 square foot of free vent area if be provided for every 150 square feet of ceiling or floor area. And that's the rule of thumb for it. And then we have this as far as basements and crawl spaces. It's actually, if the crawl space does not have a moisture barrier on it, then it's the same 1 square foot per 150 square feet. However, if they have that vapor barrier on the floor and it's properly sealed up along on the walls, then it's 1 square foot for each 1,500 feet under the floor plate. So there is there's some to this, and as far as calculating how much ventilation. And like I mentioned, if the attic, basements, crawl spaces are vented properly, typically the rest of the house takes care of itself. And there is a calculation for the living space of the houses. I'm not going to get into that at this time, but it's more of a being aware of, hey, there is a number. There's a way that it's calculated. So a balanced system is another key factor. A balanced system is equal amounts of exhaust as there is intake. So once the calculation is done to determine how much ventilation, if you just divide it in half, that's a balanced system. Half of it should be exhaust, half of it should be intake. And then whoever ends up doing this needs to find the specs for ridge vents and soffit vents and so on to calculate or determine the proper amounts and so on. So it's a whole process. It's not a like little here's a number type thing. But too much moisture can contribute to allergy problems, structure damage, mold growth, which is what we're talking about here, bacteria, mice, dry rot, insects, and so on. A lot of insects love moist, damp locations. So, but also, having the proper ventilation, will help ventilate from cleaning supplies, paint solvents, pesticides, odors, and so on. I'm not going to read every one of these. There's combustion products, heat, and so on, removing the amount of heat you need as well. Proper ventilation reduces potential air pollutants, improves overall air quality. So it's a key point here. I'm gonna speed up because I got what 7 minutes left. Proper ventilation, air exchange rate, moisture control, regular system cleaning is a key part, especially in the HVAC systems, keeping them clean. Now, a lot of times people will have their ductworks cleaned, but they always leave out the actual blower itself, and that's a separate cleaning process, or it has to be. As most people who clean ductworks don't clean the blower also, and that's where a lot of the growth occurs, and that's what really spreads it throughout the ductwork and so on. But some other stuff, greater level of filtration. So I have a couple slides on filtering. Um, Whole house and HVAC. The HVAC systems are your most common. Your standard 1-inch filters, mid efficiency filters, high efficiency filters. I'm going to that one slide. But here's a picture, just showing your typical 1-inch disposable filters here and here. Um, and then your higher end 5-inch filter, and so on. But I want to try to get to this is what I want to get to about air filters, are rated according to their minimal efficiency reporting value, MERV value. Most home filters range from 4 to 13, and 4, it's typical, hey, because it's cheap and inexpensive, but it really just keeps big dust particles off of the equipment, and that's it. So the high now, MERV 13 is kind of like above. I think MERV 12 is hospital range out here. Um, High efficiency MERV. I recommend a MERV 12 at least, because it really creates a lot of filtration of your bacteria, and your mold spores and so on. So I'd really recommend a MERV 12 about it. Now, as a place, you always put those filters cost about 20-25 bucks at your big box stores. But this is a place I would just like to give out, like discountfilters.com. You can get them for about a third the price. And it's just a source that's out there too, for me by filter. So any questions or anything, again, leave them in the Q&A. I don't really see that on my screen. I want to do a closing quote, and then we'll stay on for a few minutes if anybody has any follow-up questions. But quality and service of product is not what you put into it, is what the client or customer gets out of it. Thanks again, and here's some helpful links at www.nachi.org. And here's my information once again. If you need to contact me for anything, I'm always available. A little misspelled on Gmail, but I think that's the point there. It's Gmail. So any questions or anything, thank you everybody for attending, and it's been a pleasure.